Greetings to the brethren. I greet you all in the name of the Lord Christ Jesus, and even if you are not yet a believer in the Lord Jesus Christ, who is the way, the truth, and the life, then I hope you will join us. And I thank you for watching my video. And today I'm going to go a bit deeper into logic. And if it weren't enough, the previous videos I made showing how really simple it is to disprove what's known as Hitchens' razor, then I think this video should really slay the vampire dead once and for all. So what is Hitchens' razor? I mean, first of all, I have to just note the ridiculousness that when people come up with these principles, they always have to have it named after themselves. But if that wasn't enough, they have to call it a razor. Like, imagine if I created Evan's razor, but I was like, it's not enough. It has to be called Evan's triple folded sacred katana razor of ultimate truth. Make sure everyone calls it that, so I get credit. So I always chuckle, because if you look at the list of razors on like Wikipedia, it just makes me laugh. Speaking of which, allow me here to repent, because in my previous video, I slid a bit too much into cockiness, because I knew that I was on very solid ground. I was like, oh man, this is going to be like swatting flies, and I slipped a bit too much into cockiness, which I repented for. The Lord rebuked me for that. So in this video, I'm going to try to present things with the proper spirit, which is simply a spirit of trying to help people see the truth. So if you're tuning in and you're not a believer in Christ, and maybe you're just curious about logic and curious about how you may have been misled by people like Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens, well, thank you for joining me and watching the video. I welcome all your comments. And so what is this razor that Christopher Hitchens wields? Well, it's basically his rhetorical weapon. And what's he going to use it for? He's going to strike down all those silly people that believe in Jesus. He's motivated by a deep hatred of Jesus Christ. And he's all those simple people that believe, that think they're going to go to heaven, that trust God. He's motivated by this wrath that he has, by these designs that he has. And that's why I would like to start this by quoting from the scripture, from Psalm 37. The wicked have drawn out the sword and have bent their bow to cast down the poor and needy, and to slay such as be of upright conversation. Their sword shall enter into their own heart, and their bows shall be broken. So I thought that was very appropriate, because now we're going to see how Christopher Hitchens' razor is about to enter into his own heart and destroy itself. Okay, I repented from the cocky tone in my last video. Okay, so let's go into this a bit. Now, I'm going to go into logic and stuff here. Not too much, because I don't want to go on and on. I've also prayed that the Lord will allow me to have brevity in my speech and not just ramble on and on and on. I'll just make a quick note here. I'm certainly no expert in logic or anything like that, but it is something that interests me a lot. And growing up, my father's a computer programmer. He's actually been programming since the year 1960, and he recently retired. And so when I was growing up as a kid, he was very kind to teach me programming, and he is passionate about logic, because programming really relies a lot on logic. And so it was him who first introduced me to some of the things which I'll mention in this video, such as Sanders Peirce, Kurt Gödel, and so on. And I was fascinated by it as a kid, and while I'm certainly no expert in logic, it's something I've always been curious about. So here I'm going to share with you a bit about it, but if you want to learn more about it, by all means, check out Wikipedia, read C.S. Peirce if you want to see a true intellectual giant. But of course, if you want to see the giant of giants, the one that created all the giants, then I highly encourage you to read this right here, the Word of God, because it will blow you away, the level of intelligence of the one who wrote this book. Now, I was not raised in a Christian household, not at all. In fact, my father at a young age had me read Why I Am Not a Christian by Bertrand Russell. So I certainly am not preaching or believing any of this because I was raised in it. Oh no, I was raised by my parents, who were good people, but they're children of the 60s. They were into You could describe it in different ways, but my dad was very much into logic, very much into reasoning, very much into mathematics, and it was him who introduced me to a lot of these topics. So I want to go, without trying to go too much into it, because I want to bring it back to the spiritual level at the end of this sermon. But I want to start off, and let's say what Hitchens' razor is. It's supposed to be like this rhetorical kill shot that you can just kind of use to mock believers. And what it says is, whatever can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. Now, first of all, we have to, and what it's specifically aimed at are people who have faith in God and who believe the Bible. Now, of course, one way you could approach this would be to point out that there is a massive amount of evidence that the Bible's true. Like, just to mention one thing, the fact that it predicts the future and has been right over and over and over again. That right there, some would say is evidence that it was written by a supernatural being, since it literally has predicted the future, and literally over a quarter of it are prophecies, which so far have a 100% track record of coming true. But I'm not even going to address it on that level, because it's actually much more easy to defeat Hitchens' razor simply by pointing out some things about it that really, look, guys, I'm not a genius here. I'm just pointing out things that are obvious. The genius is, first of all, to God, but second of all, to the God of this earth, who is Satan, who has blinded people with pride. And Christopher Hitchens is one of the best examples you can find of that, because it's extraordinary that I just thought about this for really just the last couple days, and I immediately noticed not just a single disproof of the razor, but multiple ways to disprove it from multiple angles. It's the exact same thing that I noticed about the Bible when I first had my eyes opened, was reborn. I was like, wow, it's true from multiple angles. You can see that it's true here, but this separate line of argument also shows that it's true. And it's like, yeah, because what's true is true. So you can see it from many angles. The same is true for what's false. You can see its falsity from multiple angles. So here I wanted to present three or four separate angles of argument, all of which disprove Hitchens' razor. And I'm going to end it with one which is just, maybe you'll be able to see it coming, but this one just really, good luck fighting against this one. I haven't mentioned this one yet, but okay, so let's start with this. Let's look a little bit at what Hitchens' razor is. Now, you could call it a statement that purports to be true. You could call it an axiom. You could call it a proposition. These do have slightly different technical definitions, and they're used in slightly different fields of logic, whether you have zero-order logic, which is called propositional logic, or first-order logic, and I'm not going to go into it too much. You can read about it on Wikipedia, but basically, I think we could all put it this way. Even if you're not into logic, it's a statement that purports to be true. And what this statement essentially does is it purports to define a category of statements or propositions which are false. So this is a statement which says that you could rephrase it different ways. You could say that another way to put it is that any statement which is not backed by evidence is false, right? Any assertion which does not have accompanying evidence can be summarily dismissed. That's basically what Hitchens' razor is. He's basically saying, if you're going to say that this is true without providing a bunch of evidence, then based on my proposition, the razor, then I'm just going to dismiss it without evidence. But let's start examining this razor a little bit. So it says, the razor basically says that any statement, the razor itself is like a proposition, and it essentially says that any proposition which is not backed by evidence is false. Another way we could rephrase it is to say that it says all true statements require evidence. That's another way that you could rephrase it. Okay, so the very first disproof is that the statement is self-contradictory because no evidence is presented which proves it to be true. So the statement fails its own test for veracity, right? Because Christopher Hitchens didn't say, hey, here's my razor and here's all the evidence from empirical studies that it's true. Nope. He just literally did the exact same thing with the razor that he's criticizing, which is just put forth a proposition and say that it's true without offering any evidence. So that right there is hilarious. Now, there's actually a technical term for that. It's called inconsistency. It basically means that within a formalized logical system, you have contradictions. And it's hilarious because he managed to come up with a single statement that displays this property of inconsistency because, as I just put it, if we apply this standard of truth to itself, it immediately excludes itself. It's like the sentence, this sentence is false. If I say like, if you tell me like, I'm going to tell you a true statement, and I'm like, okay, I accept that it's true. What is it? And then you say this statement is false. Bam, right away. If it's true, then it's false because that's what the statement claims. So right away, his razor is just on its surface contradictory because it itself does not do the thing which it says that all true statements should do. Essentially, it defines a category of statements that are false, but it then fits the definition of that category. So I hope that makes sense. It's really pretty simple. The analogy I used in the other video is like if I said, any statement that was not said by George Washington is false. And someone then said, did George Washington ever say that? I'm like, no, he didn't. And it's like, oh, well then according to your own reasoning, it's false. Hope that makes sense. But there's other ways that you can disprove it, other than just the simplest way that it's self-contradictory and therefore unintelligible, and it's like the liar's paradox. Here's the next way that we can easily disprove it. If the razor were true, it would disprove all first-order and zero-order logic. Why is that? Because propositional logic, zero-order logic, is based on propositions, things which we assume are true. And if you don't believe me, you can read about this on Wikipedia. But the whole idea of propositional logic, or in first-order logic, where we have axioms, is that you have to start with certain statements which we just assume are true. Because before you can prove or deduce anything, you have to start somewhere. I think that's a good way to describe it. And so notice that like even the most basic syllogism could be disproved if you applied the razor to it. So basically this razor, if it were true, would invalidate the entire basis of logic itself, because even to do deduction and to prove things, we have to start with some things which themselves don't have any evidence proving them, right? Because if the statement were true, you would have to reject every single proposition, which would literally reject zero-order logic. This is the very idea of propositional logic, and all sort of deduction and everything that flows on top of propositional logic is based on this idea of propositions. You have to start with some kind of axioms. You have to start with something being true. And all of the first order logic requires zero order logic. They're not like separate things. The best analogy I can think of without going into too deeply is think of it like machine code with computers, right? Binary language, zeros and ones. That's like the most basic level. Now, nested on top of that, we have assembly language. Nested on top of the assembly language, we have higher level programming languages, but they all rely on the level beneath them, and the most basic level is the machine code. And if that code is wrong, none of them work. The whole thing collapses. So if Hitchens' razor were actually true, it would invalidate all of propositional logic, which clearly it doesn't. Now, some people think, well, maybe it does. Well, no, because logic is actually functional. It's not just abstract. And how do we know this? Because you're watching this right now on some kind of a computer. And do you know what your computer is based on? It's based on logic. Literally, it's based on something called a logic gate. There's a reason why it's called a logic gate. Now, I'm not going to go off all into the Boolean this, that, and because you can just read about it online, and people have done much better job articulating it than I have. But logic is functional. That's why your phone or your computer is working, because yes, propositional logic can be used and it actually works. So clearly it can't be all invalidated by Hitchens' razor. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to watch this right now. So yes, logic is not purely abstract. It's functional. Oh yeah, and here I want to go into a quick diversion. Literally, this is just fascinating to me. But so all computers are based on logic, and they used to be called logic engines or logic machines. The guy who invented that was this guy named Babbage, who was a British guy who was working in the 19th century. He was the first person who realized that you could basically make like a physical machine that, using core principles of logic, could actually calculate things and give you answers. And he designed this big thing. I think it was called the analytic engine. And it had all these gears, and it was like the size of a football field. And at first, a bunch of people agreed it would work. And they gave him money. The British Crown gave him money to like build it, but it just kept getting bigger. And the problem was when you're trying to make a mechanical computer, it just takes so many gears that the whole thing just becomes it just becomes it consumes too many resources. It's too hard to make a whole football field sized thing with these small gears. It's just impractical. And Babbage kept insisting, no, the idea works. And then they believed him and they went along with it until it used up too much money. And then they even had programs for it. And you can read about Ada Lovelace and so on. But basically they abandoned it. But not long after that, people realized that that the idea is valid, that you really could use this analytical engine to do math problems. And before that, they had actual human calculators, human computers, that's what it comes from, who basically would do all this mathematics and give you the answers. But of course, humans are prone to error. So that's why Babbage says, he came up with essentially what's the architecture of a computer, where you have a sort of memory, you have a processor, you can program it to different operations, and he showed that it would work. But basically, he died without it being completed, and they started to lose faith in it. But then not long after that, more and more people started to realize, man, the guy is really correct. Like, this thing really would work. But I want to point out something that a lot of people may not know about the history of computers, because if you ask most people, who invented the computer, the answer is, of course, Babbage. Oh, well, you can actually go back further and talk about like looms, these things that weave stuff, and you can trace the concept back even farther. But as to the architecture of the modern computer with its central processing unit and what is essentially memory and its programmability, that goes back to Babbage. But you'll notice that although they actually did, I believe, end up completing the analytical engine, and I think there is a functioning one somewhere, that we don't use those. Because what we're using are electronic computers. So the real question is, where did those come from? Who was it that figured out that basically all mathematical operations can be done electronically? Now, most people are going to say Claude Shannon. He's kind of the one who got all the credit for it. This guy around 1920 published some really brilliant doctoral thesis, and it's kind of like the father of information theory. But just to point out a random fact that most people don't realize, Claude Shannon really wasn't the guy who discovered that. The guy who discovered that was actually this guy named C.S. Peirce, Charles Sanders Peirce, one of the smartest people who ever lived. Man, if you think Hitchens is good at logic or wise or anything, dude, read Peirce. So Peirce in the late 19th century. So basically what happened in the 19th century was, although the original analytical engine wasn't completed, more and more smart people started to realize that this could work. We really could build this mechanical computer thing that just wouldn't be wrong, right? Using logic, and I won't try to explain it too much, but basically they realized this is a good idea. So they started programs at different American universities trying to complete the thing. And they're like, we got to make the gears smaller. We got to somehow make the whole thing smaller and more efficient, because having this giant football field sized thing is just too expensive, too inefficient. But more and more people were like, we just got to make the gears smaller. We got to figure out a different architecture so that it's actually doable. So all these universities had programs trying to do it. They're realizing like this is the future. So check this out. C.S. Peirce, who is like definitely one of the greatest logicians ever, who sadly many people don't even know about him, although now his reputation is growing. Man, this guy was really, really smart. So he had been a professor at some university, I forget where. But basically, one of his, an individual who had been one of his graduate students, I believe was working at Harvard on their computer program, their analytics engine program, because now all the major universities in the US were trying to essentially complete what Babbage had come up with decades earlier. And they're like, how do we get the gears smaller? How can we make this thing work? We know the concept's solid. How can we do it? And so there was this very bright graduate student who I think it was Princeton, but I could be wrong, who was working on it and was like, they just couldn't figure it out. They couldn't get the gears small enough. It just kept being too cumbersome. And so this guy was like, who is the smartest person I know who I can ask for help with this? And he remembered his old professor, C.S. Peirce, who I think had taught mathematics or logic at whatever university the dude at Princeton had gone to. So the dude at Princeton writes a letter to C.S. Peirce and basically, says, hey, we're all working on these analytic engines. We're trying to get the gears smaller. How can we get the gears small enough? How can we redesign it? Here's some ideas I have. So Peirce, who was working on a bunch of like unrelated logical problems, he gets the letter and like he sends this letter back. and like it's hilarious. You can like read it yourself. But basically what he says is like, he says, yes, I received your letter and it was so fascinating that I thought about it for the entire weekend. And of course I'm just wildly misquoting it because I'm just saying it from me. But he basically says something, first says something like, yes, in my mind, I performed every possible reconfiguration of the mechanical engine, and I am sad to tell you that it is doomed to failure. There is no way that you can fit in enough gears or get it small enough. It's all impractical. And you would think that would be the end. But then Peirce says, so I then began to think of other ways to do it, to transfer it to a non-mechanical means. And right away you would think like, a non-mechanical machine? Like, what is that? A spiritual machine, right? Like, what the heck? Like, and Peirce says, and after several hours of thought, or like it's something hilarious like this, Peirce says, I realized that you could do it by pushing current through a wire. And he then draws a diagram like on the back of a napkin showing that if instead of having gears, you just had wires and you then pushed a current through and then you had like what are basically transistors and they acted like switches and they could perform these simple logical operations like what are called logic gates. And so Peirce designs a completely functional electronic computer out of wires, draws the whole diagram like on this napkin and tells the guy, do it like this, abandon all the mechanical gears and do it by pushing electricity through wires and making switches, which at the time was something that literally no one had ever thought of and seemed just totally nuts. He sent the letter back and he said, yeah, look, just make something like this. This will work fine. So anyway, that's how to do it. I hope you're doing well. Great to hear from you, Chester. Sends the letter back. The guy at the university got the letter and just looked at it and was like, this is just nuts. Because imagine how mind-blowing it is if all you've ever seen are mechanical machines and someone's like, yes, you can make a machine out of electricity moving through wires with this resistance that switches. People are just like, this is crazy. Like, so the guy didn't even like try to do it. He's just like, wow, that guy Peirce he's a smart man, but this is just, maybe he showed it to some other people and they're like, what the heck? A non-mechanical machine made of electricity? They're just like, what the heck is that? So anyway, Peirce's letter then was like undiscovered for like years until it's like 50 years later, Claude Shannon, when he basically discovers and he publishes his famous doctoral thesis, and he basically shows that like any sort of mathematical operation can be done via electronic switching circuits. He later found Peirce's letter and he said something about it like, wow, like I forget what he said exactly, but he basically said, I spent 30 years coming up with this idea. He said, if I had just found Peirce's letter at the beginning, it would have saved me 30 years of hard work. So like, that's how smart this guy Peirce was. Oh, and by the way, if that's not impressive enough about Peirce, check this out. So in the late 19th century, it was like the height of, and I promise I'm going to get back to the Hitchens thing. This is a passionate subject of mine. I just love this stuff. So anyway, so if that doesn't blow you away, that this guy Peirce invented electronic computers in the 19th century, 50 years before anyone else, over the weekend. Oh, and by the way, the design he made on the napkin is now universally agreed that it's a completely functional computer. He was totally correct in his design. He got it completely right. They should have followed what he wrote on the napkin. It would have sped up humanity's progress by 50 years. But if that's not impressive enough. So Peirce, in the late 19th century, at the height of Newtonian determinism, so like classical Newtonian mechanics basically says that everything's like a ping pong ball bouncing around, and then if you know the position and the velocity of everything, you can like predict where everything's going to be. And everybody at that point thought that because there was so much success of Newtonian classical mechanics, everybody thought it's resolved, that everything's deterministic. That's where Laplace's demon comes from, which is basically just this idea that not a literal demon for those who are watching who are believers. It's like a thought experiment, which basically says that if you had like a demon or just some entity that knew the position and the momentum of every particle in the universe at any point in time, you would then be able to predict everything in the future and everything in the past, since it's all just a deterministic system, right? And so like this was the height of Newtonian determinism when everybody thought that it's proven, Newton's stuff is great. Like everybody, like there's literally no point in human history when the entire scientific community was totally convinced that everything is like deterministic. Remember, this is late 19th century. This is way before Einstein even. This was like, I can't remember when it was, but it was like the 1870s or something like that. Right? Because it had accomplished so much. And by the way, this is also an indictment of science because at the time they thought that they had solved almost every problem of science. And I think that there was like one thing, like the problem of black body radiation or something. They're like, if we can just solve this final problem, then science will know everything. We're like 99% of the way there, which if you look, scientists think that literally every generation until something comes along and they're like, oh, wait a minute, actually, there's this whole other thing. So that's why it's funny when people are like, believe the science is proving everything. Literally just look decade by decade since Newton and you'll notice that they keep thinking they have it all figured out until they're like, wait a minute, but the problem of black body radiation, they're like, wait, our whole theory's basis, we have to change it all. It just keeps happening again and again. But what was amazing about Peirce was, and for the life of me, I can't even figure out how he came to this, because Peirce was a scientist. I think he was trained in chemistry, but mainly he was a logician and a philosopher. Mostly he just thought really intensely, which you can tell that he just thought up electronic computers in his mind. He didn't even do any tests. That's the amazing thing. When he designed the electronic computer, he literally just thought about it a lot over the weekend and was like, here's how it is. Simultaneously figures out that like none of the mechanical stuff will ever work. And that you can make it with wires and switches and logic gates. Just thought that up without doing any experiment. But what's amazing about Peirce is at the height of Newtonian determinism, Peirce in like 1870 or something, without doing any experiments, just by thinking philosophically. And I've tried to understand what series of philosophical insights led him to grasp this, and I can't figure it out. But Peirce, purely through thought experiment and philosophy, basically says that, wait a minute, determinism can't be correct. There must be something fundamental at the most basic level of reality, which is fundamentally indeterminate. Right? He called it Tychism. He named it because Tyche, I believe, is the Greek goddess of chance. And so I don't even know if he elaborated that much about how he realized this, but it was purely through like logic and philosophy and thinking about it. And he basically comes up with this concept of Tychism. He publishes like some papers about it in some like obscure like journal and basically says like, no, the universe is not deterministic. There's something at the very heart of the universe which is indeterminate, not just that like we don't know it, but that it's fundamentally indeterminate, that true chance must be operating at the most basic level throughout the entire universe. And he said that, and of course, like with the computer thing, nobody really took it seriously. Everybody's like, but why? And I don't know if he really explained it that much. He's just like, I thought about it a lot, and yeah, there's this thing called Tychism, and it's in the universe. Dude, what happens later? Quantum mechanics shows that that's true. But what's amazing is quantum mechanics, the scientists, as they're like discovering it in the early 20th century, none of them believed it. They're like, this is nuts. Like they're all like, they had to see a lot of experimental evidence that showed the basic principles of quantum mechanics, the Copenhagen interpretation. Like they came to it through a lot of data. None of them thought that it was true. They all believed in determinism. Even Einstein was like, this is ridiculous. They just kept getting more and more and more and more like experimental data. And finally they had to start admitting that like there really is this weird indeterminate thing because at the quantum level, the electron isn't even in one position. It's actually smeared in this weird cloud of probability, i.e. it's in an indeterminate state until it's exposed to the environment, i.e. you make a measurement and then it collapses down, but then it goes back into the probability cloud and so on. And so like the most brilliant minds, only after just being bombarded with all of this experimental data, finally started to accept quantum mechanics. And even really brilliant people like Einstein, even they like wouldn't truly accept it because they had been so schooled in Newtonian determinism. But Peirce, without any experimental data, just figured it out philosophically somehow, like 50 years before all those people, and just said, oh yeah, by the way, there's this indeterminacy at the core of everything. It's Tychism. So this is a dude who invented digital electronic computers on the back of a napkin and foresaw quantum mechanics like 50 years ahead of time. And just nobody listened to the dude because they're like, he's so out there. And then like 50 years later, everybody's like, oh yeah, there is this whole quantum thing. Oh wow, computers do work. Gosh, look what we're using. So anyway, that's just my quick little homage to Peirce of how just sharp this guy was. And I'm then going to read a quote of his, which I really love about philosophy, later in the sermon. Okay, so enough about Peirce. He's just, most people haven't heard of the guy, and the dude is fascinating. You want to see a really sharp human intellect? Read that guy's writings, and you'll be like, wow, this guy is very thorough in his thinking. So anyway, where was I? Okay, brief aside. Oops, I went a little further than brief. Okay, so anyway, let's go to the next point about why Hitchens' razor is false. Okay, so even if we assume that the razor is true, let's take this approach with it. Let's because remember, the razor says that everything that's asserted needs to have evidence that proves it, right? And if it's asserted without evidence, then we can just dismiss it summarily, right? So, but what if we were trying to prove the razor by adding evidence to it? Because the whole problem with the razor is that it doesn't provide any evidence. Therefore, it fits its own definition of false statements, right? But what if we're like, well, maybe we could provide evidence to prove that it's true? Well, that's not going to work either. Because if we assume the razor is true and we try to make it pass its own standard of veracity, i.e. become consistent and not contradict itself, the only way to do it would be to discover every true possible statement and show that they all have evidence which backs them. Because even if every single statement or proposition which we find can be shown provable by accompanying evidence, that still does not prove that there couldn't be other ones out there that don't. So the only way you could prove it would be if you literally knew every single true statement in the universe, right? But this is how extraordinarily weak Hitchens' razor is, that even if you could do that, there's an even stronger way that it's disproven, right? So like, even if you somehow could find every single possible true statement that could ever exist and show that they all have corresponding evidence, but wait, you can't. And it's actually been proven. Not just that like we don't, know it because we don't know every possible true statement, but actually we know that that's not the case. Okay, so this is what I call the coup de grace, because this really wipes the argument out, as if that stuff wasn't enough. Like, check this out. Okay, so, yes, so as I wrote it, even if you could discover every single true statement in the universe, show that there's evidence that backs them, even then, it still doesn't account for the fact that there could still be other undiscovered statements which are true that don't have evidence that back them. But now, let's go really deep and let's really finish off this undead vampire creature that's deceived people now for however long it was since Christopher Hitchens made it up. Okay, so what I want to point out about the razor, and this might seem obvious, but let me point this out, is that it's not just requiring any evidence to accompany the proposition, it's requiring evidence which proves or at least suggests a proof of the proposition. What I mean is that if I assert that it's always raining in Singapore, it always rains in Singapore on Tuesday, and then I present evidence that O.J. Simpson murdered Nicole Brown Simpson, people would say that that's invalid, right? It doesn't say that, like, I can put forth an assertion and then just present any evidence of anything. No, that's not what it's asking for. It's asking for evidence that proves the assertion, right? So what it's really asking for is proof. The evidence is just the means of proof, right? That's what Hitchens' razor is really about. It's really saying, prove it. That's why you can't just throw up evidence of anything at all with any assertion and it makes it true. Clearly, Hitchens isn't saying that. He's saying you need evidence that proves that assertion. So what Hitchens' razor is really is about proof. And it's just asking for proof in the form of evidence, right? What it really is asking for is proof, and it's asserting that it's saying that this proof should come in the form of evidence. That's why the razor is often spoken of in terms of shifting the burden of proof, right? It's really saying that if you're going to make a claim, then you have to prove. If you're going to make a claim that you say is true, you have to prove it. The burden of proof is on you to prove that it's true. It's not on me to prove that it's false. If you're going to make a claim and say that it's true, the burden of proof is on you, right? Would everyone who follows Hitchens' razor agree that that's what it's doing? It's asking for proof in the form of evidence, and it's saying that the burden of proof is on whoever makes the claim. And so therefore, if you make the claim without any proof, I don't need to prove that it's not true. I can just dismiss it until you prove that it's true. Ooh, but here's where we're about to get really wiped out if we go deeper into Hitchens' razor. Okay, so essentially, another way to state the razor, it's essentially, one way is that it's kind of like the core idea of empiricism, the idea that we need to do some sort of tests or experiments to get evidence, and then we're going to reform what we think is true based on what the evidence tells us, which is at the very core of the philosophy of science, right? And so another way you could say the razor is all true statements require proof via evidence. So if a statement is put forth without any evidence, i.e. lacking a means of proof, then it must or should be considered false. Okay, and here's where I throw down the card which drives the stake through its heart. Enter Kurt Gödel's Incompleteness Theorems. Now, if you know much about this subject, you're like, it's over. It's done. It's done. Okay, let me explain for those who don't know what Gödel's Incompleteness Theorems are. But basically, okay, here I wrote brief summary. Okay. Oh man, we're going to have to go off and do a side to explain this a little bit. Okay, so there's this big problem towards the end of the 19th century, which is that you have mathematics that had been advancing, and then you have like logic, like formal logic, which is like a theory that involves converting things into symbols. It looks kind of like mathematics in that it has sort of like equations, but it's about taking statements, converting them into symbols, formalized symbols that have certain rules and so on. You see stuff with like the P and the Q and stuff like that. That's like formalized logic. Now, you might assume that logic and mathematics were somehow fused together, but actually they're not. This is what sounds very strange, right? But people were noticing this towards the end of the 19th century. And they're like, we know math is true, but is there actually logical proof of it? And the reality is that there wasn't. And this started to bother a number of very bright people, such as David Hilbert, such as Bertrand Russell. And they thought, okay, we need to fuse them together. We need to undergird mathematics with solid logical proof, because there had been a lot of advancements in logic. There was a lot of understanding of different forms of reasoning, deduction versus induction. Oh, by the way, Peirce came up with something called abduction, which is in many ways more useful, and I won't go off into that. Another thing, check out Peirce, super smart guy. I already mentioned that. Anyway, so there was this big push, this big project toward the end of the 19th century, and essentially what Hilbert and Russell were trying to do is they thought, okay, we need to create a formal logical system which we can link with mathematics, which will then essentially logically prove that mathematics is true. And once we've created this, we can use it to like prove or disprove any mathematical statement. Now, in order to do that, we're going to need axioms. Axioms are functionally the same thing as propositions. It's just like a statement that we start with that we know is true. Like we all know the syllogism is like saying, all men need to eat food to survive. Bob is a man. Therefore, Bob needs to eat food to survive. That's like a basic syllogism. That's called deduction. And we know that if the premises are true, which are the first two statements, and we know that the reasoning is valid, then the conclusion must be true. And realize here that proposition, premise, axiom, statement, assertion, they're all kind of words for the same thing. It's like just a statement that's true. Look up proposition at Wikipedia if this part's getting confusing. But anyway, so what Bertrand Russell and David Hilbert started to try to do was they're like, you know what? If we can just figure out the correct set of true axioms, the statements that we know are true, and we can kind of link them all together, because the whole useful thing about having axioms and deductive logic is that you can derive new true statements from previous things that you knew are true. Look at the syllogism. If we know that all men need to eat food to survive, and we know that Bob is a man, from those two true premise, we can then deduce and derive a third true conclusion, a third true statement, right? And so what Hilbert and Bertrand Russell started to do in this thing called the Principia Mathematica was to come up with the perfect set of axioms, which would all link to each other, which wouldn't be inconsistent, meaning that they wouldn't contradict each other. They would all be like perfectly consistent. And if we just come up with enough of them, we can show how natural numbers and natural arithmetic perfectly fit over this system. And since we can then show that the system within its formal language is essentially logically perfect, it therefore shows that mathematics as we understand it is logically perfect. Now, what they all assumed was that mathematics is. So it wasn't like anyone doubted mathematics. It's like they want to prove it. They want to show through pure logic. And since there had been a lot of advancement in pure logic, they're like, we're at the point when we can finally join these two fields together and we can show that mathematics is logically provable to be true. And also we can use it to check things and to derive new truths. And it's going to be this huge advancement. And, Hilbert gave some speech where he's like, we can know, we must know. And they started working on it. And they started making this thing called the Principia Mathematica, which is basically the set of all the axioms. Of course, they started to run into little paradoxes and little problems. And they're like, okay, well, the thing is, you got to find all the right axioms. And essentially, there's many ways you could describe this. And I highly recommend watching YouTube videos about it where people go into it in depth. But basically what they're trying to do is come up with this perfect set of axioms that all link together like a circle, like to close the circle. Like they all perfectly link to each other, they all support each other, and once the circle is perfectly closed, now we know that that like sort of signs off on mathematics, so to speak. It's kind of hard to put this stuff into words. That's why professors get paid a lot to think how to express this stuff. I'm just a dude who lives in my room. And, so anyway, so it was this big project and everybody thought like, this is the future. This is the forefront. We are going to complete the Principia Mathematica. And they made a lot of progress and they made this long logical proof of why 2 + 2 = 4. It's on like page 88 of the Principia. And everybody was like, we're getting closer. We're getting closer to closing the circle. But, there's this little paradox. Russell's like, oh, wait, there's the set of all sets that don't belong to themselves. And basically they started to find these little errors, but they're like, we're going to get it. We're going to finally make this thing where everything perfectly proves everything else. And it's almost like we won't need faith. Because if you think about it, what is faith? Faith is just like a proposition. It's just like an axiom. The whole idea of faith is like a statement that you just take to be true. And anyway, I have a whole separate video on that, about how people who say, oh, we don't want faith, we want evidence, are actually using more faith I don't want to go into it now because it's a whole separate thing. I need to stay on topic with the sermon. But yeah, if you think that faith is like an inferior form of reasoning, wait till you see how there's twice as much faith involved in the people who don't think that they're using faith as there are people who are using faith. Faith is in many ways, it's just like an axiom. It's something that you just take to be true, like a proposition at the base of zero order logic. So anyway, Hilbert and Russell and Whitehead were working on this big project to close the circle, to get all the set of axioms. But then along came this guy named Gödel, who was this Austrian dude. It's like 26 years old. And he started focusing on this thing called the liar's paradox, which is simply the statement, this statement is false. Now the question, is it true or is it false? Because if it's true, then it's false. But if it's false, then it's true. It's because see, it says that it's false. So if it's true, then it's false. But if it's false, that means it's true. It's a paradox. So Gödel started thinking about the liar's paradox, and he's like, what if you shifted it and instead you made it say, this statement is unprovable. Now, I'm not going to go into it all. I highly recommend you check out Gödel's Incompleteness Theorem because it's fascinating. If you want to see a good intro to it, check out Douglas Hofstadter, who wrote an incredible book called Gödel, Escher, Bach, Eternal Golden Braid. He has some really great videos where he breaks down Gödel's Incompleteness Theorem and how it's proven. But basically, without going too much into it, let's see. A brief summary of Hilbert and Russell's project, unite logic and mathematics into a formally provable system. For this to work, there must be no internal contradiction. That's what's called consistency. And also, it has to be complete. Complete means that the system will answer every question that can be posed within its language. So like this system, whatever you ask it, it has to either tell you that it's true or false. Technically, it has to either say that the statement or the statement's negation are true, meaning that the system can't just not answer. So like once we have all the axioms and the rules of inference, then any question which can be expressed in the language of that formal system, the system, one, should never contradict itself, and two, it should be able to give us a true or false value for every question that we can express within the system's formalized language. That's what they were trying to do. So then Gödel came along, notes this paradox, and through a brilliant work of mathematical reasoning, he actually shows that this is impossible. That for any system which has enough sophistication to model arithmetic, essentially, to model natural numbers, look up Peano arithmetic, Peano, if you want to see like an example of it. What Gödel shows is that essentially it's impossible to close the circle, that the system can never be both consistent and complete. And he does it by employing this thing called a diagonal argument, and it's based off his inspiration was the liar's paradox, but he switches it to make this thing with this statement G that says that this sentence is unprovable, and it essentially injects this paradox into the whole thing. And what Gödel essentially shows is that the Principia Mathematica is fundamentally doomed because this paradox is at the heart of all logic. It's almost like the deepest insight anyone has ever had into logical systems, and what it showed was the thing that Hilbert and Russell were working on was impossible. Now, Gödel was just a genius. He just came up with this when he's like a 26-year-old graduate student, and he publishes this, right, at some conference. John von Neumann, who's another really smart guy, happened to be at the conference, sees the presentation of Gödel and is like, whoa, this kid's onto something here. He immediately writes, I think, to Bertrand Russell and is like, yo, you may want to check this out, right? So Bertrand Russell didn't accept it at first, because basically what Gödel is saying is that what you're trying to do is fundamentally impossible, not just because you don't have the right axioms, but due to a fundamental paradox within all logic itself. And Gödel actually proved it mathematically. So it's not just like an irresolvable paradox. People get that confused sometimes, that it's like a paradox. No, it's not. Gödel actually proved that any system that's complex enough to model natural numbers and arithmetic can never be both consistent and complete. That's why it's called the Incompleteness Theorem. Well, there's actually two. There's the first and the second Incompleteness Theorem. But okay, why am I going on and on and on about this? Okay, so what Gödel proved, function, Peano arithmetic, example, it can't be both consistent and complete. You can never close the circle, but what Gödel showed is that within any system that's at least complex enough to model arithmetic, let alone systems more complex than that, like, I don't know, our entire existence or anything more complex than basic numbers, that there will always be true statements within the system which are not provable. Okay? Now, this blew everyone's mind. How could there be something that we know is true, but you cannot prove that it's true? And Gödel showed that this is the case. And at first it led to everybody just really hating on Gödel and Russell being like, no, that must just be a weird exception with that one statement. And Gödel shows that no, there's actually infinite statements within any system which are true but cannot be proven, are fundamentally unprovable, and yet they're true. And that the more you try to close the circle, the more it opens up further circles. And basically what Gödel said is, sorry, Bertrand Russell and David Hilbert, your life's work is utterly doomed. But in doing so, he did them a favor because they're wasting their time. And they fought tooth and nail against it. And Bertrand Russell was like, well, what if we ban self-reference? He came up with this thing called type theory, which is basically just saying we won't make self-reference be allowed. But basically, time went on and everybody accepted that Gödel was right. And it led to a bunch of further advancements through Zermelo and this and Tarski that and a bunch of people and Turing. Eventually, all the other really smart logician people were like, Gödel's right. There is this fundamental feature in all of logic, which shows that systems can never be closed. They can never be consistent and complete. And it led to all kinds of breakthroughs. And to this day, it's considered, ask anyone who's into logic, they'll probably be like me. They'll start going on and on about how brilliant Gödel was. There's still some people which to this day resist it, but they're a very tiny minority. Pretty much everyone has accepted it, and it's led to all these breakthroughs. And later they expanded it, and basically it was shown that this isn't just one freak thing that occurs with that one with the Gödel sentence, that it's something that actually is a fundamental feature of all logic. And a funny analogy I thought of once of how to describe it to people is like, imagine that logic is like a person that you can ask questions, and you can ask logic like, logic, can we trust this? statement, logic, can we trust that? And logic always tells you like yes or no, right? So you say like, logic, can we trust like this reasoning? And logic says like yes. Logic, can we trust this book? Logic says like no. But it's like essentially what Gödel did is Gödel says, what if we ask logic itself if we can trust it? And then what he proves is if we ask logic itself, logic, can we trust you? Logic says no. And that then throws this huge wrench into everything. It doesn't mean that nothing logical is ever useful or anything like that. But what it means is that the sort of certainty that they were trying to find is fundamentally elusive. And the way that this relates to Hitchens' razor is that, yes, Christopher Hitchens, yeah, I know the guy's not around anymore, but yes, there are statements which are true but are not provable. So Hitchens would say, oh, well, if you don't have evidence proving the statement, therefore we know it's false. It's like, guess what? There was a guy named Gödel who came around the 1930s who showed that that is not the case, that there are and always will be an infinite amount of statements which are true but cannot be proven. And so right away, Gödel's incompleteness theorem, and he proved it mathematically. If you don't believe me, just check out like a Douglas Hofstadter or some other video that shows the diagonal argument and how basically Gödel converted the Gödel numbering is the real genius of how he did it. Okay, I'm starting to go off way too much into the thing about Gödel, and I promised that I would bring this back to a spiritual place. So anyway, yes. To summarize quickly, first of all, the supposed razor of Hitchens is very silly because it denies itself. It's self-contradictory. It defines a category of false statements, but it itself fits the category of false statements. Two, the only way to add evidence to it would be if you knew every single true statement, which we clearly don't. And even if somehow you could, Gödel shows that actually that's impossible because there are true statements that cannot be proven. And they will always exist, and there's actually an infinite amount of them. So anyway, okay, let's get it down to a serious topic now. Thank you guys for letting me ramble on about it. I don't claim to be an expert in Gödel or anything like that. He was a fascinating man, and by the way, the final blow, Gödel believed in God. And oh man, Bertrand Russell, who vehemently hated God, just like Christopher Hitchens, man, how much it must have stung that Gödel, who I think was a Lutheran, came up with this thing that just blew away their life's work. But, thank God he did, because otherwise, the incompleteness theorem completely shifted the entire course of all formal logic, because as everyone slowly accepted Gödel was right, they just abandoned that whole approach and they accepted, and it actually led to breakthroughs with stuff like, I think, the halting problem and Turing and a bunch of other stuff. But anyway, the point is, Gödel won the day. He proved it. It can't be denied. Super smart people like Bertrand Russell tried to deny it, and they failed. And in the end, everybody was basically like, yeah, Gödel's right. It's very bizarre how logic is like that, but that's just the truth. So yeah, essentially Hitchens' razor is literally states the very thing that Gödel proved with mathematics is not true. So did Hitchens ever realize that? I don't think he did. Why is that? Now we're going to get spiritually serious. Okay. The razor basically claims that there's no such thing as a statement which is true but unprovable, that every true statement must be provable, and if it's not provable, therefore it's false. Gödel says no. Gödel proves that there are statements which are true that are unprovable. There's actually an infinite amount. But now we're going to go to a different piece of paper. Okay, so now I want to point something out. So how did Hitchens never notice this? How did he spend his whole life staking his whole reputation on this silly razor, which I just pointed out like 3 or 4 separate ways of disproving, which was already mathematically disproved by Gödel decades ago? How did he never notice? So check this out. Now we're going spiritual, baby. So the central character of Hitchens' approach to argument is his witty, sort of smug, insulting style. Now, guys, you've been tricked by Christopher Hitchens. His logic is weak. His reasoning is nothing. Like, what he is he's good at insulting people. He's kind of like a stand-up comic. Now, admittedly, he's quite funny. That's what he's known for, these things called Hitch slaps, where he'll say this little witty, he's kind of like one of those French sort of court of Versailles people where they would ridicule each other with various decadent phrases and they would chortle and sip their cognac. That's what Christopher Hitchens is. He's not a logician. He's not a reasoner. He's not a deep thinker, even slightly. Otherwise, he would have noticed at some point the stuff that me, a random guy who lives in a room, who reads the Bible and makes YouTube videos, it took me like a day or two to think of like 4 separate disproofs of his precious razor. Why did he never think of that? Well, because the thing about it is that his whole style is based on what's called sophistry. Now, what is sophistry? I wrote down the dictionary definition. Sophistry is the use of clever but false arguments with the intent to deceive. The whole way that Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris work is that they work very hard to signify that they are these sophisticated thinkers, and they sort of are sipping their cognac, and they speak in the received pronunciation, and they respond to everything in a witty way. And it's all a disguise. It's like all a front, because what they know is people associate wit and charm and humor with intelligence, right? And so what they know is that if people see their wit and charm and humor, people will then assume, well, that guy must be really intelligent. Well, that guy must have really solid reasoning, right? And it is true. It does take intelligence to create very good humor. But if someone is witty and clever in their insults, people think this must mean they're very intelligent, and therefore their reasoning must be sound. And it's almost like Hitchens is always saying to everyone, don't you dare try to examine my logic because I'm so smart. This is easy for me, and I'll humiliate you. This is pure sophistry. Sadly, the deception that he used on others, he believed himself. Because clearly, I mean, I got to say, it's almost embarrassing when you see some of Hitchens' reasoning, just how, just how embarrassingly made it is, just how weak it is. Like, just, it's almost like, could he have gotten it any more wrong? But why did he not notice it? Well, the central feature of Hitchens or Sam Harris is that they are proud. They are deeply proud men. They're so certain of their own intellectual superiority that, and you can see this about them, they never make the slightest attempt to check their own arguments for error, to do what's called falsify their own arguments. Now, of course, you may know Karl Popper was a really important guy in the philosophy of science, and he points out that it's very important to see if an argument is falsifiable. And we won't go off into a good thing I didn't write brief aside about that. Otherwise, I'm going to babble on and on about yet another subject. Try to keep it to a spiritual level, Evan, pull it together. Okay, so this is probably the part that God actually wants me to really say. Okay, so Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens, man, they are just swelled up with pride. And what's very sad about it is, as a result, they never actually check their own arguments. They never even make the slightest attempt to falsify their own arguments, because they are not led by logic or reasoning. They are led by pride. Pride is at the heart of everything. Now, if you want to see the mark of a genuine intellect, there's all these lists about, like, this shows someone's really smart. Well, you know what? Look for curiosity. Curiosity, there's various ones, but people who are highly curious, in my opinion, that's a very strong sign of intellect. And what you'll notice about Hitchens and Sam Harris is their extraordinary lack of curiosity in their own subject matter. It's like their entire argument is basically like, well, of course we know this is wrong. Imagine someone who thought deeply about this book. When I was at Oxford, we would call them the leçons de la Bouffon, which, of course, you know what that means. Their whole argument is just based on them being puffed up like these pufferfish, being like, well, of course I didn't have to think deeply about that. And it's incredible the degree to which they're not even slightly curious about their own subjects. It's just mind-blowing. Like, because in their heart, they didn't even feel the need to check their own formula. At the end of the day, the very thing that the razor states that, oh, well, everything should have evidence, well, the thing that they never applied it to was their own beliefs. They didn't bother to check all the prophecy in the Bible. They didn't bother to check the fact that the Bible describes the earth as a sphere, literally centuries before anyone realized that the earth wasn't flat. At no point do you see them ever like really going into any kind of a deep theological argument. Their argument is just based on emotionalism. It's just based on pride. And actually, the way they argue is extremely feminine. If you look at them, they will, what they actually use is a quintessentially feminine debate strategy. Now, look, I'm not saying femininity is bad, but I am saying that for men to adopt such a feminine strategy as Hitchens and Harris is just shameful, right? Because what do I mean by this? What I mean is that they are exceedingly focused on style over substance. They will keep taking things back to a frivolous level. Like what I mean by the feminine debate strategy, just think of a 14-year-old girl. If you try to talk to her about something serious, she'll be like, roll her eyes, like, Dad, come on. Keep taking it from like the serious to the frivolous. Hitchens, when you try to bring forth any sort of like logic or reasoning, instead of being like, yes, and this reasoning follows this, we'll examine this. No, it's like he always has to make a little joke. He's got to get the crowd laughing. Or he has to say something like, wow, very serious are we? A bit too serious. It's a very female debate strategy, which is to keep, whenever there's hard questions or there's earnestness or there's sincerity, you kind of just mock it. It's essentially what's called snark, and it's very, very feminine in style. So nothing against femininity, but for men to express this and to embrace it, that is definitely a sin. 1 Corinthians 6, it says that the effeminate shall not inherit the kingdom of God. Notice it doesn't say the feminine, because women can be feminine, but the word effeminate implies men who are being feminine. And we often see this debate style with, well, you see it in 14-year-old girls, you see it with homosexual men, and you see it with Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris, which if you watch them carefully, it's incredible to see how essentially what they're saying, and I have a whole other sermon prepared about this, but essentially what they do is they're sort of like, well, technically my opponent may be right, but aren't they rather uncool or square? And they have this kind of snark, and they're always sort of winking at the audience. But what it really is it's a form of weakness because it's very passive aggressive. They're extremely passive aggressive. And the whole essence of being passive aggressive is that you don't want to deal with direct aggression because you can't handle it. So instead, you have all these little snide, glib remarks. If basically just read the current media, read the feminist websites, read like Jezebel. I mean, hilarious how they name it, Jezebel. Read that, and what you'll see is that is the style of Hitchens and Harris. While they posture on like, we are these logical men, what you'll actually see is they will keep trying to like use these diversionary tactics. Another thing is like emotion. Like when you present a logical argument to someone and they say like, how dare you? How dare you? Like, see what I mean? That's like a fundamentally sort of feminine style of debating, which is if I say like X and Y, and therefore I suggest that Z is this. Like a masculine style would be to respond to it earnestly and be like, however, if you argue that Z is this, I counter with this. Whereas Hitchens or Harris will be like, Z is this? Does he really believe that? Or be like, how dare you? How dare you? Like, right? It's like diverted into emotion. And it's all to avoid the actual logic, right? And from their minds, they're just so sure their logic is so solid that they think they can afford this sort of, call it rhetorical kind of like, it's like decadence. It's like this rhetorical, it's like a 14-year-old girl. Now, look, I'm not saying that there aren't, righteous 14-year-old girls out there, and many women don't do this. So please realize I'm not saying all women do this. I'm saying wicked women do this. And there's a lot of wicked women out there. But a man who does this is especially shameful and is like doubly wicked. So anyway, I actually have a separate sermon prepared about that. So there's this thing, I used to study what are called the pickup arts, how to pick up women. And there's this thing that pickup artists observed, which, by the way, every woman knows about this. A lot of men, you may be learning about this for the first time. But when you talk to women, especially in groups, what you'll see is they'll say certain things, but then they'll kind of look at each other and have little glances. And basically what the pickup artist discovered is they call it girl coding. It's like this little code that's going back and forth between the women. Like the classic example, it's like a secondary level of communication. The classic example would be like if a guy goes up to a woman in a bar and he's like, hey, so I just wanted to talk to you, you know, and the girl might say, oh, it's really nice to meet you. And then she'll girl code to her friend with her eyes, like, you know, and then her friend will say, Stacy, I have to go to the bathroom. Will you come with me? And the girl will be like, oh, I'm sorry, I have to go, right? So the girl coding is like a secondary level of communication, which is like little eye looks, little tone of voice, which basically like avoids direct confrontation. And recently I was watching a video where you can see this pastor going up to people on the street, asking them what they think about the Bible. And there were these two like 21-year-old girls. And the pastor would say well, do you believe in that the Bible, you know, do you take God seriously? And the girls would be like, of course we take it seriously. And they would girl code to each other like, wow, look at this weird loser, right? And I was just watching it. And as someone who studied the game and I can read the girl coding quite well, I was like, wow. Like they were saying to the pastor things like, oh, we respect that. Oh, yes. But they're girl coding to each other with their eye language like, haha, what an idiot. Can you believe this? Right? Why do I bring this up? Dude, look at Hitchens and Harris. They girl code like crazy. It's incredible. They do more girl coding than actual teenage girls. Like, I just want to point that out. I think later I may even like make like a video where I show it, but I just want to say that like, yes, they're exceedingly passive aggressive in their arguments. They don't ever actually engage in like serious logic or reasoning. And like, here's my final example of it. Like, imagine like Sam Harris sees this video, right? Imagine me and him were like sitting on a stage. I want to show the difference between like the way that like a real man should respond to debate, which is by being earnest, by directly responding to the argument. And any man who actually has like a strong argument and has like believes in masculinity will do that. But like, imagine if I said, you know, I'll give you a quick example of like these statements. Like there's Christopher Hitchens, once you see this, you'll see it's literally all he does. He plays the crowd. He takes serious stuff and sort of makes it into a joke. He puffs himself up with emotion to like disguise all the weaknesses in his argument. And then he just snipes and snarks himself out like a 14-year-old surly girl. Like, for example, there's some point when he's debating with Frank Turek, the apologist, and he's like, and he says, you know, this is a question which has baffled many thinkers. We know it's a very difficult question. It's baffled so-and-so and baffled so-and-so, and I believe it probably perplexes all of us. Dare I suggest even the great Mr. Turek here. Da-da-da-da-da-da. And like, see that? See that little snipe? That's him being like, oh, look at how arrogant Frank Turek is, right? And of course, everyone gets it. Everyone feels it. But why does Christopher Hitchens not be like a man and say, Frank Turek, you are arrogant and you think that you understand things that no one does. No, he doesn't say it. He says it like, well, we all agree it's a very complex issue and I can't solve it. And dare I suggest even the great Frank Turek may not be able to solve it. Dare I suggest such a thing? Which is really him being like, wow, that guy's an arrogant prick, isn't he? I roll to the audience, right? Now, imagine that I like said this and I'm like on a stage like with Sam Harris, right? Like, I want to point out like the two different ways to respond. And I want to ask you, which way do you think Sam Harris would respond? Right? Like, so I say this whole thing. Yeah, Sam Harris girl codes a lot with his eye language. Christopher Hitchens, they have a very feminine style of debating because they don't want to face the actual logic of the incompleteness theorem, blah, 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 blah. Do you think that Sam Harris would A, do this and say, Mr. Carey, if there is something that I have said that is not clear to you, then I ask you to say it now. Bring forth my statement, and if it were unclear or in any way passive, bring forth the statement, and happily will I say it and say it again. If you are accusing me of having slighted you in some way, and indeed I have, happily will I repeat it, because you are arrogant. This is wrong, and if anything is unclear, I will stand and defend it. Do you picture Sam Harris doing that, or is Sam Harris going to do this? Microphone. Ready? Sam Harris, legs crossed, right? Microphone. Wow. It sounds like someone sure knows a lot about 14-year-old girls and how they behave. Audience chuckles. Yes, I wasn't expecting that. You see, when I the other night was reading Finnegan's Wake, it seems like my opponent, Mr. Carey, may have been watching the TV show Gossip Girl. Audience laughs. Wow, I couldn't help but notice that as he was talking about his theory about 14-year-old girls, he seemed to grow rather excited. Well, perhaps I shouldn't say anything more. We wouldn't want this video to get banned, would we? Everyone chuckles. Yeah, which style is Sam Harris going to use? Is he going to stand up and be sincere like a man and come forward with the argument? Well, just watch his videos and you'll see what I mean about that very effeminate style of debating, which I'm going to say here is shameful. Dude, back in the day, real men, dude, if it was the Wild West, and some man accused you of something, you would stand up, you would confront them directly. All this stuff about snarking and making little comedic things and then throwing in little references, the whole humble bragging. You know, I saw this thing where Christopher Hitchens, when he was dying of cancer, I saw there's some video where Richard Dawkins, who too does this, by the way, was giving this long introduction of Christopher Hitchens, which is one of the reasons that these people are so weak at argument and reasoning, is that real intellectual minds will challenge each other. They will come back and forth. Whereas all these new atheist people, they just sit there and blow smoke up each other's behinds and just talk about how great and how genius they are and how foolish all the religious people are. Whereas people who are really into logic and reasoning, it's like von Neumann and Russell and Gödel going back and forth in intellectual warfare. But all these new atheists just sit there flattering each other all the time. They don't have time to look at the arguments. Imagine needing to examine our own arguments against superstitious religious fools. Imagine someone who thought they had to do that. So anyway, the point that I was going to make was that Dawkins is giving this speech about how brilliant Christopher Hitchens is, but he's so humble. And then Dawkins is in fact, I will here quote myself in my review of Dawkins' preeminent novel, the review of mine, which was published in the Oxford Quarterly, on the front page, actually. I said the following words. Dude, I'm just cracking up. I'm so he quotes himself, and then he can't just say in my review of Christopher's book. He has to be in my review of Christopher's book, which was published in the Oxford this on the front page.